Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Islamic podcast. So I'm back. So in case you guys can clearly see, I cut my hair. It's been a while. Sorry for the delay. So recently, actually, I was, to my surprise, Rationality Rules actually made a response to my video. I usually don't get any responses to the videos I made in the past or make it usually. So this is kind of surprising for me. So I want to thank Steven for making a response. And to be honest, it was kind of disappointing because it feels like he didn't really there's just one response that he made to my main argument, and it wasn't that satisfying. But either way, so let's see what he says, and then inshallah I'll make my comment. Okay?
Well, hold up. Since Islamic Calling is about to offer a critique, let me recap the relevant point I made shortly after he paused it. The reason I brought up dracunculiasis was to illustrate just one of many species whose life cycle necessitates inflicting great suffering on other sentient beings. Such parasites are, or can be argued to be, an example of gratuitous evil, that is, evil that exists without justification, and gratuitous evil is incompatible with an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God.
Okay, so that was Steven's first point, and here actually me and Steven, we agree. We agree on the definition of grotesque evil, okay? Which is basically a type of suffering that is caused without any justification, right? And if a triomni God exists, this type of suffering cannot exist. That's basically his main argument. For example, imagine someone is torturing a cat for fun, right? And they have no real justification or good justification for doing this. This would be a perfect example of grotesque evil, right? Which has basically making someone else suffer for no reason. Even in this situation, a argument can be made against this argument, which is that if a God doesn't exist, then how does Stephen decide that whether, if anything happens, whether that's good or bad? I mean, for that, he need to establish that there is a type of objective morality, and where is that coming from exactly? Now, I know that he has like his own kind of justification for this, but again, because this is especially a problem because in the past we have done things that we thought were good but actually wasn't good. For example, in the past we used to drill people in the head and thought that would cure them, right? And we thought that was good. This type of practice was known as trepanation. Yeah, in reality, this didn't do anything.
In most cases, I know there are some medical surgeries that uses this technique. However, back in the day, this was used for many things like curing mental problems and even for mystical reasons, when in reality, this didn't do anything.
This didn't cure people. So we thought this horrible practice was a good thing. So how can we trust our own subjective moral judgment to decide whether something is actually good or bad, especially if it's being done by an all-powerful deity, right? How do you decide that? I mean, how do you know that that's actually good or bad? Because, as I showed, our morality is constantly changing. And the reason it's changing is because our morality is based on human knowledge. And human knowledge is limited. And because it's limited, when new information comes in, we have to constantly change our moral position, right? So an argument can be made here, which is that, premise 1. If human knowledge is limited, then our concept of good and evil is also limited. Premise 2. Human knowledge is limited. Conclusion. Therefore, our concept of good and evil is also limited. So, which is why, based on this limited perception of what is good and evil, we can never actually say what is actually good and evil. Okay? Or because we don't have any type of objective moral criteria for this. Because our morality is based on human knowledge, which is limited. For example, Ibn al-Qayyum, who is one of our great scholars, he said the following: evil as an independent phenomenon whereby no dimension of good is involved has no existence in this world. There is nothing in our existence that can be called pure evil, because every evil in this world is good from one angle or another. For instance, sickness harms the body from one angle, while from other angles test patience, evoke resilience, and may even strengthen immunity. Most disliked things are usually this way, never void of some benefit or another for a human being. You can read about this on Divine Wisdom and the Problem of Evil by Ibn al-Qayyum. page 380 to 430. And that was my main argument in my previous video, which is that this idea of grotesque evil is something that doesn't exist, or is something that we don't believe exists from an Islamic point of view. For me, the word evil means that when you make someone suffer without any good or logical reason. So from this, we can make an argument, which is the following. Premise 1. If natural disaster increases people's generosity, then causing natural disaster cannot be called evil. Premise 2. Natural disaster does increase people's generosity. Conclusion. Therefore, causing natural disaster cannot be called evil, because there's a reason for why this exists, and it always leads to some kind of good outcome. So this idea of a type of evil existing that is completely unjustified or completely logically unjustified simply doesn't exist. And since it doesn't exist, this argument is not a problem for us. Okay, so this is something the atheists always do. So you will notice that atheists, whenever they make this type of argument from evil type arguments, they always use the most extreme examples. So basically here he is committing the appeal to extreme fallacy. So in case you guys don't know, appeal to extreme fallacy is a fallacy where you use the most extreme example as the norm, when in reality it's not the norm, right?
Let's bring up the appeal to extreme fallacy for longer than a second, as that way we'll be able to actually read it. Description: erroneously attempting to make a reasonable argument into an absurd one by taking the argument to the extremes. Logical form: if X is true, then Y must also be true, where Y is the extreme of X. And then the author, Bo Bennett, gives us an example. There is no way those Girl Scouts could have sold all those cases of cookies in 1 hour. If they did, they would have to make $500 in 1 hour, which, based on an 8-hour day, is over $1 million a year. This line of reasoning attempts to dismiss that the Girl Scouts made $500 in an hour by appealing to the extreme. It states that if X is true, that is, if the Girl Scouts made $500 in an hour, then Y is also true. That is, the Girl Scouts are among the highest paid people in the world. The problem, of course, is that Y doesn't follow from X, since it assumes many additional things, including that the Girl Scouts work 40 hours in a week and that there is only one Girl Scout in Girl Scouts, as opposed to a team.
Okay, so this was a mistake on my part. So basically what happened is that in my head, I was thinking of a different fallacy other than this one, but I couldn't remember its name. So while I was shooting the video, I thought that this was appeal to extreme fallacy, and later on I didn't check, and that's the one I ended up with. But he's right, I'm wrong here. And so I thank Stephen for correcting me on this. Yes, he's right, which is that this is not appeal to extreme fallacy. However, this is a fallacy, okay? And I will explain why I think this is a fallacy. So basically the point of a logical fallacy is that as long as you can show the logical defect or logical error in the argument, then it's a fallacy, okay? So it doesn't matter what you call it, okay? You can call it the Stephen Fry fallacy, for example. But point is, it is a fallacy, and I will explain why I said his argument in that clip was fallacious, if that was the argument he was making. But later on, he denies it, and we'll get to that, inshallah. But let's continue.
But with this fallacy in mind, let's see how Islamic calling bolsters his accusation against me and the problem of evil.
So here he's using this example of this disease, of this parasitic disease, where people get infected by this disease and this worm slowly comes out of the body. So when you hear about it, obviously it sounds very disgusting, right? But the thing is that this disease is actually very uncommon. It's rare. But he's using this type of extreme cases to show, look how bad things are in nature, right? And completely ignoring all the other normal things that exist in nature.
No, that's not what I was expressing, and nor was it what Stephen Fry, David Hume or Epicurus expressed. To follow as close as possible the logical form of the appeal to extreme fallacy, what I was arguing was, if X is true, that is, if God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent and omniscient, then Y is also true, that is, gratuitous evil doesn't exist. And I was referencing dracunculiasis as an example of gratuitous evil. Crucially, this isn't an appeal to the extreme. Crippling parasites, cancer in children, and forest fires are not extreme versions of God's supposed attributes. No, they are contradictions of what God's supposed attributes entail. So the accusation of me appealing to the extreme here is just completely off base. It's just not accurate.
I would disagree here. Okay, so he's actually misrepresenting me. I was not responding to his main argument here. I was responding to the clip that I just saw. So in case you guys don't know, I actually basically split the video I'm responding to in different clips. And so if I see a clip, I respond to that clip, right? However, the clip that I responded to made the following argument, which is that
Conculiasis, which is derived from the Latin affliction with little dragons, is a parasitic infection caused by the guinea worm. A person becomes infected by drinking water that contains microcrustaceans infected with guinea worm larvae. And once one's stomach acid dissolves the crustaceans, the larvae then penetrate your digestive tract, escaping into your body, where over the following year, they grow up to 80 centimeters or 31 inches in length. The worms then mate, with the males dying shortly after, but the females eventually migrate to your subcutaneous tissue, where they cause an extremely painful blister to erupt that compels you to submerge the wound in water. Then, over several days or weeks, the worm slowly emerges from the laceration and expels thousands of larvae into the water, which in turn infects crustaceans, thus continuing the so-called BEA beautiful circle of life.
Now, if there is a God, and he is, as theists tend to insist, all-powerful and all-loving, then for what possible mysterious reason did he create these disgusting fiery serpents, as they've been referred to in scripture?
basically he's asking, if a God exists, then why did he create like this type of fiery serpent? Which implies that he's saying that because if a God exists, then what he's doing here is evil. And I thought that was the argument, right? So basically, in a nutshell, the argument would be, and which I thought he was making, is this one. God causes X, causing X is evil, therefore God is evil, okay? Because that's what it sounded like to me. He was questioning, like, why is God doing this, right? Because this is evil, right? And if he's doing this, then he's evil, right? That's the argument. That's what he said. And that's what I responded to. And yet, he's saying that that's not the argument he made. Because later on, the argument, he made his main argument, because I thought that this was a side argument he was making, right? But later on, he denies this and says that, no, this is not the argument I made. Which, by the way, yes, I agree that he also made another argument later on, which I responded to. But he did say this. Like, now he's acting like he never said this. And if this is the argument he's making, then this is absolutely fallacious. Because look at the argument. God causes X. Now, X is obviously an extreme example of what God does, right? It completely ignores all the other good things that God does in nature, right? So when you take it in isolation, it gives an exaggerated picture of what God does. As a result, it leads to a conclusion that doesn't follow because it ignores all the other good things that God does in nature. And because the conclusion doesn't fully represent what is actually happening or what God is actually doing, it's fallacious. It's a fallacy. It doesn't follow because the conclusion doesn't follow because it's not true. It's not a true representation of what God does, because God also causes Y, Z, C, and etc., right? Which are all good things. And he completely ignores them. Because he ignores this argument doesn't fully represent what God is actually doing, which is why it's a type of misrepresentation or a straw man. So yeah, this is clearly a fallacy. Now, I don't know what to name this fallacy. Honestly, I tried to find it. I couldn't find the name of it. But this is a fallacy, as you guys can clearly see. And I explained why this is a fallacy. So he's wrong here to say that this is not a fallacy. It is a fallacy. And later on, he actually agrees with me as I explain this fallacy. And so, but you know what? I'm going to assume the best of Stephen, and I'm going to say that maybe I'm just misinterpreting things, right? Maybe I'm just wrong, right? Maybe this is not what he meant, and this is just a side comment he was making. So fair enough. My mistake. I thought this is the argument he was making. Maybe it's not the argument he's making. But regardless, let's continue. Here, the argument is basically this, right? If a grotesque evil exists, then an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowledgeable God cannot exist. Grotesque evil exists, therefore an all-knowledgeable, powerful God cannot exist, right? That's the argument. And if we apply this theodicy, or should I say this principle, that the argument that I made in the main video, that this argument does not work in Islam, right? It doesn't work against Islam because we simply don't believe this concept of grotesque evil exists, okay? We believe that any type of suffering that exists has a cause and a reason, good reason behind it, which leads to other good reasons. So it's not unjustified, okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does send suffering and does test us, but there's a reason for testing us, right? It's not without any good reason. It's for a very good reason. Sometimes it causes us to be good people, and it tests us to see which one of us is good people and which one of us are not. And on top of it, he also shows us infinite mercy. So when you take all of that into consideration, this grotesque evil doesn't exist. Yes, suffering does exist, but we simply don't believe this grotesque evil exists. So it's not a problem for us. And yeah, and I can just end the video here, and that's the response. Because so the argument is basically that if a triumphing God exists, then grotesque evil cannot exist. Grotesque evil does exist, therefore triumphing God doesn't exist. But if we can show that grotesque evil doesn't exist, which is to say that this type of suffering that exists in the world has meaning behind it, and it leads to other good things, and there's a good justification for it, then it's no longer a grotesque evil. It's just test for us to see how we respond to it. And it's not evil, especially if you consider the amount of mercy and love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us, and therefore it's not evil in any shape or form. So the argument doesn't work, and especially doesn't work against Islam. And we can end the video here, but regardless, let's continue.
Here's my favourite. Theists can simply drop one of the omni attributes. For instance, God being all-loving. Many Muslims in fact do precisely this, and in doing so they nullify the argument. It's just not a problem for them. If God isn't all-loving, then him creating parasites that inflict untold suffering on his favourite mammal just isn't a contradiction. Nor is him burning to death millions of sentient beings in forest fires. It's perfectly halal. However, as William Lane Craig among many others have argued, this renders the God of Islam not to be the greatest conceivable being, since an all-loving God is greater than a God who is not all-loving.
We do believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-loving. However, what we disagree with is this idea of grotesque evil, which is that a suffering that exists without any justification. We don't believe that. We believe that tests and trials exist, but there is a good justification for it. Okay, which means that this, this grotesque evil simply doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, it's not a problem for us. But we don't drop any of the qualities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't know which Muslim does that. He talks about William Lane Craig, and I find it kind of funny because why should I care what William Lane Craig says? Mufti Meng says that Allah exists, so doesn't mean he exists. Why should I care what he says? Now I understand that he's trying to appeal to this argument of ontology, right? Or the ontological argument. Now, to look at the ontological argument, I can pull it up. But me, personally, I don't deal with ilmul kalam. Right? You guys know me. I don't deal with ilmul kalam, and I find ilmul kalam arguments to be very weak, kind of pretentious, and frankly haram, for a number of different reasons. So I don't deal with them. But since he asked me this question regarding, he's trying to imply that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't fit the description of this ilmul kalam argument or the ontological argument, therefore he doesn't exist, which is not true, because the argument itself is fallacious and problematic. But so let's take a look at the argument, and I'll make my comment, inshallah. Okay, so this is the argument, right? Premise one would be, it's possible that a maximally great being exists, and this is Dr. Craig's argument, by the way. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Then it follows to a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. Even when I was back in the day when I was into ilmul kalam and this type of stuff, I always thought this argument was kind of silly. It's a very stupid argument. It doesn't prove that God exists at all. I think
Arthur Schopenhauer
said that this argument is a good joke. I don't know if he actually said that or not, but I heard somewhere that he said that. And yeah, it is a good joke, because it doesn't make any sense, right? So this whole argument relies on human imagination. So this whole idea starts with this first premise, which is that it is possible that a maximally great being exists, which, I agree with. It's possible. And then it says that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, yeah, it's possible that it exists in some possible world, right? Then it says that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Yeah, it's possible it exists in every possible world. Then it says if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Now this is where the problem comes in. Because just because something exists in a possible or kind of this imaginary world doesn't mean it exists in the actual world. Okay? Again, we go back to the same problem, which is that human imagination is limited. And in Islam, we believe this concept that there are things beyond our imagination, and we can logically prove this as well. For example, let's have a thought experiment and take a time machine to the time before dinosaurs were discovered, right? 6th or 5th century. If we go to these people and tell them, hey, do you know that these great things called dinosaurs actually existed once in this world? They would laugh at you. They will say that no, there's no way, right? They will laugh at you. Or if you tell them like, do you think that there will come a time when people will be able to fly? They'll laugh at you. And yet now we have examples of people flying or using gliders and whatnot, and using airplanes. So these are things that was clearly not in the imagination of people because they couldn't ever conceive of it. Or things like black hole and all this kind of crazy stuff that we discovered lately. So all of this proves that there are things out there that are completely out of the imagination of people, right? Because they're out of our knowledge, out of our imagination. So if there are things that are out of our knowledge and imagination, based on our imagination or limited knowledge, we can never say whether something actually exists just because it's possible that it may exist in some possible world. Okay, so there's a equivocation happening here, which is that just because it's possible that something exists in a possible world doesn't necessarily mean it exists in the real world. Because it's possible that dragons may exist in some possible world doesn't necessarily mean it exists in the real world, right? And that's the thing. People have imagined that things like dragons have existed, but that doesn't necessarily mean dragons actually exist, right? For that, you need evidence, right? So, yeah, this is why this argument completely fails. The fourth premise is false. It simply doesn't follow. So, yeah, and that's the point. And this is why this argument fails, because just because something may possibly exist in all possible world doesn't necessarily mean it exists in our world. Because there's a huge difference between our world or the actual world versus a possible imaginary world. Craig's God is not all loving.
Here in this clip, Brother Hamza Zortzius and Amaran Hussein refutes Dr. William Lane Craig. They show how his biblical Christian God is not all loving.
Throughout history, Christian missionaries have made it a objective and goal of their lives to misrepresent Islam through poor translations of the Quran, misrepresenting certain concepts and ideas about the deen. And now we find individuals, even today in the 21st century, respected individuals, professors, who are again misrepresenting some core fundamentals of Islam just to paint that negative perception. Now, in particular, what we're going to be discussing today is a clip by Dr. William Lane Craig, which has been circulating again. You were the one that actually told me it's quite an old clip that was there a few years ago, but it's been recirculating again, where he speaks about Allah and he speaks about the love of Allah mentioned in the Quran and compares it to the love of God in Christianity. Now, we're going to go through the whole clip and we're going to break it down in a second, and we're going to get your thoughts on it and highlight why Craig's view is incorrect.
There is an argument against Dr. Craig's argument, and it's based on two premises and a conclusion. Number one, for God to be maximally loving, he has to be maximally forgiving. Number two, the biblical God is not maximally forgiving. Three, therefore, the biblical God is not maximally loving. And we're going to unpack this. I think the first premise doesn't have to be discussed, because if someone is maximally loving, they have to be maximally forgiving.
Repeat those three again, just so everyone's on the same page.
So premise number one, for God to be maximally loving, it entails, or he has to be maximally forgiving. And this is not a controversial premise, because forgiveness is the language of love. Mm-hmm. Number two, and this is the controversial premise, the biblical God, according to William Lane Craig, is not maximally forgiving. Number three, therefore, the biblical God is not maximally loving. Now, why? Why is the biblical God not maximally loving? So not maximally forgiving, and therefore he's not maximally loving? It's very simple. Number one, God's love, according to a biblical narrative, is rooted in suffering. God's love in a biblical narrative is rooted in forgiving humanity outside of the relation of the human being and the divine. And it's based on an event that supposedly had to happen. And not only that, It's based on you accepting the event actually happened. It's not rooted in your relation to the divine, your heart being sincere and asking forgiveness to the divine.
Mhm.
Contrastingly, the Islamic conception is based on maximal forgiveness, because it just takes a human heart to repent to the divine. And this is why in the Christian tradition, because of John 3:16, because of the sacrifice and the atonement, what the biblical narrative is saying, it's saying that human sin limits God's mercy. So from this point of view, William Lane Craig, I think he's basically being a little bit of a sophist here, because if you really understand the Christian doctrine, then you have to admit that God is not maximally forgiving. If he is not maximally forgiving, then how can he be maximally loving? Because to be maximally loving entails maximal forgiveness as well. So that's the summary of what we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be talking about the fact that actually, have you not read that Allah says about himself that he is Al-Wudud? He is the loving. That's one of his names, which comes from the Arabic word wud, which means the loving that is giving. He is excessively loving. His love is so pure and so maximal that it's even greater than any form of love you can imagine in a worldly sense. Even a mother's love, because a mother, she needs to love. God doesn't need anything, yet he loves. Imagine how pure and maximal his love is.
I think the question is better reworded by saying, is the concept of God in Islam the same as the concept of God in Christianity? Do we have the same understanding of God? And there I argue that they are worlds apart, that the concept of God in Islam and Christianity is very, very different. And one of the principal ways in which they are different is that the Muslim concept of God, I believe, is morally defective. It is a morally defective vision of who God is. As the greatest conceivable being, a morally perfect being, God must be all-loving. And this is exactly what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that God loves sinners. His love is impartial. It is universal. It is unconditional. And this is a world of difference from the God of the Quran. According to the Quran, God does not love sinners. He does not love unbelievers. He is an enemy to unbelievers. God in the Quran only loves those who first love him.
Okay, stop here.
Okay.
Yeah. So as we said, he basically misrepresents Allah in the Islamic tradition, God in the Islamic tradition, where he's basically saying that God doesn't love sinners. He doesn't love those who, disobey him, the wrongdoers. Now we have to understand, what does he mean by love here? Because as we said, mercy is also a synonym for love. So does God have mercy for the disbelievers? Absolutely. We've mentioned this in the beginning. Allah says his mercy encompasses everything. Does God have mercy for wrongdoers? Absolutely. Now, but I also want to challenge his conception of love. What type of love are you now talking about? Because there are different types of love. The Islamic tradition is very nuanced, right? We have many names, meanings, words for love, and they have a particular reality. Now, it's easy to use the English language, say love, but what do you actually mean? So I would actually ask him that question, because I want you to think about this, bro. And I wrote this down on my phone. Let me just unlock the phone. Now, is it maximal love to love everything the same?
That's the big question.
Yes, and this is the problem, because it is not maximally loving to love everything the same. Can I love goodness the same way as I love badness, evil? In actual fact, would it be loving for me to love evil? I mean, let's think about that, right? So think about this. Perfect love is to love goodness, to love mercy, to love kindness, to love connecting with one's creator, to love peace. And it follows that if you love something, you have to hate its opposite. which means you have to hate evil. You have to hate the opposition to love. You have to hate malevolence. You have to hate polytheism. You have to hate chaos and destruction. Are you saying it's perfect maximal love to love that which is a barrier to love? I mean, this doesn't make sense.
So another point that Dr. Craig makes is that he thinks that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not all loving because he doesn't love sinners, which doesn't make any sense. I mean, imagine, let me give you guys an analogy, right? So imagine that you tell your mother that tonight you're going to rob a house, right? And your mother loves you very much and she always supports you and she tells you not to do it, right? But you don't listen to your mother and you ask your mother to help you in robbing the bank, and your mother refuses. And then you go and rob this bank or this house, and you say that your mother is not loving, okay? She only loves you conditionally. If you do something bad, she doesn't love you, right? Now, is the son right here? No, the son is clearly wrong, because, I mean, love, the way we understand it, is not that you love someone unconditionally. That is never the description of love that exists in the real world. And so, love in a meaningful way only exists when you love something that deserves it, or love someone who deserves it. When you love someone who doesn't deserve it, then that's not love. That's actually spoil. You're basically spoiling your child. For example, imagine this mother actually loved, quote unquote, loved her child so much that she went and helped her rob a bank. Then that's not love. That's basically her spoiling him, right? So, if someone truly loves someone, then of course they would not support that person when they're doing something wrong, because they would want the best for them. And this is clearly not the best for them. As for why this type of disease exists, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually answers this question in the Quran itself. For example, he says, do the people think that they will be left to say we believe and they will not be tried? You can read about this in Quran 29:2. For example, in another verse, it says the following, and we will surely let them taste the nearer punishment, short of the greater punishment, that perhaps they will return. You can read about this in Quran 32:21. Now, if you read the tafsir of this verse, it says, Ibn Kathir actually breaks this down, and he says that basically the reason why trials and tribulations exist is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to test us, right? He has put us on earth to test us. So earth is not supposed to be some kind of paradise. You're supposed to go through trials and tribulation. That's one of the main purposes why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us here, right?
Okay, so you're claiming that gratuitous evil exists because Allah wants to test us. That is, Allah permits evil not because it's necessary to achieve a greater good or prevent an equally bad situation, but rather and simply because it tests us. Thus, you're dropping the omnibenevolent claim, and with it the notion of Allah being all-merciful.
So he just contradicted himself. So here he's committing the equivocation fallacy. Because if you guys remember, earlier when he said grotesque evil, in his definition, he said that it is a type of suffering or a type of evil that exists without any justification.
Of gratuitous evil. That is, evil that exists without justification. That is, evil that exists without justification. That is, evil that exists without justification.
Right? But here, even though I gave a justification, he's still saying this is grotesque evil.
Okay, so you're claiming that gratuitous evil exists, gratuitous evil exists, gratuitous evil exists.
So which one is it? Does grotesque evil means that something that exists without any justification, or does it mean something that exists with justification? Can't mean both at the same time, right? It's a contradiction. So here he's basically committing the equivocation fallacy. So in case you guys don't know, equivocation fallacy is, you know what, I'm gonna read it because in case any fallacy police wants to get at me. Okay, so let's use this. So the description in Bob Bennett's website is the following. Using an ambiguous term in more than one sense, thus making an argument misleading. So for example, the form is like this. Term X is used to mean Y in the premise. Term X is used to mean Z in the conclusion. And that's what's happening. So in the beginning, you will notice that the term X, which is the grotesque evil, was meant Y in the premise, right? Which is meant that it's a type of evil that exists without any justification. Then later on, I give justification, right? Which is that it's a test. And if it's a test, that means that it has a justification for it. Now, you could argue whether that justification is justified or not, but that's a different point. But then later on, when he says uses the term X or grotesque evil again, then he uses it to mean Z, which is completely different. Which is that, It's a type of evil that exists that has justification. So, it doesn't follow. It simply doesn't follow. So yeah, it's a fallacy. And again, I'm not denying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is loving. I'm simply denying that grotesque evil exists. So again, this is also a straw man.
So according to Islamic calling, Allah deliberately composed numerous mass extinctions before the dawn of humankind, in which billions of animals suffered to test us. He created parasites, nickelback, and famine to entice people to 1. Somehow figure out that he exists, and 2. Convince us to sufficiently grovel at his feet. Quick question. Are you sure your God is all merciful?
Yes, because none of that contradicts his mercy. Because the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is that he gives us infinite, he shows us mercy of infinite nature. He is constantly showing us mercy, right? For example, Stephen, I will give you a challenge. Right? Go for 5 minutes without breathing. You know what? Go for 10 minutes without breathing, right? See how that feels. Doesn't feel very good, right? Now, imagine someone actually helping you breathe. Now, imagine you're sick, right? And you're having problem breathing, and you need a tank. Now, a person comes and he gives you an oxygen tank, right? And he saves your life. Now, would you thank that person? Yeah, you would, right? And yet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is constantly, for every moment, every time you take a breath, He's helping us breathe. And yet, you never thank Him. Okay? This is the level of mercy He's showing you. So, yes, Stephen, if He does all of this, which is to literally help you breathe, literally help you stay alive, literally feed you, right? And literally make sure that every cell in your skin works properly, right? He does all of this of infinite proportions, right? And then He sends some test and then helps you overcome those tests and makes you better people. Then how is that evil? Explain that to me. Explain to me how that can be evil when He's literally giving you everything you need, everything you want. And you're saying that just because He's sending some test, therefore He's evil? That doesn't make sense. So this idea of grotesque evil doesn't exist. Like I said, there's a reason for why this exists. And no, this doesn't break His mercy, because His mercy encompasses everything. Now, He talks about animals, right? And this is something He constantly brings up. And I already explained this to him before in the previous video, which is that in Islam, we believe that even animals will be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if they have any complaints, they can talk to Allah, right? And there's a hadith which says, it was narrated from the Prophet, peace be upon him, in a hadith that has many corroborating reports and isnads, and he said, Allah will judge between His creation, jinn, man, and animals. On that day, Allah will let the hornless animals settle its score with the horn one, until when there is nothing left to be settled. Allah will say to them, be dust. At that point, the kafir will say, would that I were dust. You read about this in Sheikh Albani's book, Al-Sisilat Al-Sahih, number 1966. It's classed as Sahih. So yeah, here the animals never complained to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means that any complaint they had, well, they were happy with His judgment, right? So yeah, in the day of judgment, they won't have any complaints. So if they don't have any complaints, then what's the issue here? So Stephen, are you saying that simply causing suffering is evil? Okay. Are you saying that simply causing suffering to a living thing is evil, no matter what justification there is? Because if you're saying that, then you're actually digging yourself, shooting yourself with a foot. Because if that is evil, then what about women who gets abortion? Are they evil? I mean, they're hurting a living thing, right? And one could argue they're doing it without justification, or at least without a proper justification. So are they evil? What about doctors? Are they evil, Stephen? Why not? Because according to you, any type of suffering, if it's caused, even if it has a proper justification, it's still evil. So all the doctors in the world are evil. Of course, that's not how we understand evil to be, right? That's not grotesque evil. Grotesque evil is when it's something, a suffering that exists without justification. As I showed, there is justification for why this suffering exists. And the reason he sends this type of trials and tribulation is to see if we're actually sincere or not. Whether we turn towards him or if we move away from him, right?
And here we go. Islamic calling is coupling being sincere
or not,
with being convinced of Islam.
Whether we turn towards him or if we move away from him, right?
But they're not synonymous, and this is a major problem for many theists. The majority of theists just can't admit that there's room for rational disagreement. It can't be that atheists have earnestly and sincerely considered the case for God and come out as an atheist, despite the fact that most of the world's leading philosophers have done precisely this. No, theists insist upon defining atheists as bad, insincere people, deserving of eternal damnation.
Again, this is a straw man. I never said that. I don't know where I get this from. I mean, I already talked about this in my previous video. I mean, on the day of judgment, there are people who will go to the hellfire. They will complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say that, send us back. If you send us back, we promise that we'll be good, right? But because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all knowledgeable, he knows that even if he sent them back, they will never turn to Allah. Okay, because these people are arrogant. Okay, and that's the issue here. And no, that doesn't mean that you're one of those people, because I don't know whether you're one of these people or not. Okay, I mean, I don't know if I'm one of these people. Right? May Allah forgive me. May Allah protect me. Right. So we know for a fact that people who go to hell are not sincere. We know that for a fact. At least that's what we believe in our religion, right? And no, we're not saying that you're going to go there, because I don't know. Maybe you'll become a Muslim by the end. I don't know. And who knows, maybe it might be the case that I go to hell and you go to heaven. So no, Stephen, I'm not condemning you to hell, because I don't know. So I don't know why he's saying that.
Or to approach this view from another angle, if a parent deliberately sets up a room for their children, saturates it with disease and only supplies some of the children with adequate sustenance some of the time, most people, arguably all, would find this to be anything but merciful.
No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that it's not that he gives us sustenance some of the time. He gives us sustenance all the time. Every moment of your life, he gives you sustenance. Okay? And no, this isn't the case that he just leaves you in a room and goes away. No, he's in the room. Okay, let me fix your analogy, right? He takes his child, he goes into the room, he stays with the child, he gives him guidance, tells him what to do, right? And he takes care of his every need. He's constantly feeding him, he's taking care of him, he's caring for him. When he gets diseases, he strengthens his immune system by giving him food, right? He also has friends. He forces the friends to help him as well. And then, every now and then, he lets him make his own choices, and then sometimes tests him. And sometimes he gets diseases, but then he teaches him how to defeat those diseases, right? He teaches him how to treat himself, how to feed himself, how to grow crops, right? He teaches him all of this so he can survive, okay? And when there's this type of disease comes, he gave him immune system so that he can fight those diseases, right? So no, this is not a good analogy because it's not the case that he's just simply giving him sustenance some of the time. He gives him sustenance all the time. And when we give charity and when we turn towards him in obedience, this automatically reduces suffering, because if you give charity to people, then they can use that money to get better medicine, get better healthcare, right? And this way you can fight things like this type of disgusting diseases, right? So in a way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually makes sure that we as human beings can become better people.
But this is Allah you're talking about, the Almighty, the All-Merciful. And so, for what possible reason do you limit his powers? Why couldn't he have created humans so that we can develop without experiencing such suffering? Was giving children leukemia really the only way of getting people to donate?
See, what did I say? He's committing the Stephen Fry fallacy again. He's appealing to the extreme and not really representing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually doing, right? I mean, I already explained it. It feels like I'm explaining it like 100 times, but okay. So, and this is the thing, that this is a question that actually I asked him, right? You show me how it's logically possible for there to be goodness without suffering. You tell me how, because it's not possible. It's a dilemma. Don't you get it? It's a logical dilemma, right? Dilemma is basically this: if goodness exists, then suffering has to exist. Okay? If suffering doesn't exist, goodness cannot exist. Okay? These are the only options. So if you want to claim that something else is possible, you have to prove it. And you haven't been able to prove it. How is that even possible? Because it's not possible. And even if it's possible, then it's possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that that will not lead to a good outcome. It's possible that might lead to a bad outcome. And that's why he's doing this. Right? But the point here is that the challenge I'm throwing at you is to show me how it's possible for people to be good and charitable without there being poverty. Right? Like, for example, those atheists you're talking about, right? Those really nice atheists, and they're giving charity and doing also all these nice things. How are they supposed to do those things if poor people don't exist? How? You tell me how. It's not possible. It's not logically possible. Right? So I think deep down you clearly realize that this suffering has to exist for us to be good people. Okay? Because if this suffering doesn't exist, we can be good people. And that's the point. But yeah, that was my response. I want to thank Steven for taking the time to respond to my video. I know I'm a very small channel, but yeah, thanks regardless. I invite you to read the Quran if you can, and if you have any further question regarding the Quran or anything in regards to Islam, you can ask us. And also, if you have any question regarding which books to read in regards to know more about Islam, you can reach out to us. Inshallah, we can help you out. And yeah, thank you, Steven, for responding. And I want to also thank a lot of Steven's audience who's been nice enough to leave a lot of rude comments. But I mean, I get it. You disagree with me, that's fine. But at least you guys could be. To be fair, a lot of people were sincere and they're very nice. So thank you for that. Thank you for not being completely rude. But yeah, that's my response. And inshallah, my next video will probably be on Hinduism. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.